Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Sacred Anarchies, a post-church podcast. I am here with the usual suspect, one of my favorite humans, Barry Taylor.
Hey, hey, hey.
Hey, how you doing?
Doing good. I always get thrown by the little voice from Zoom now that tells you this is being recorded.
This is being recorded.
Is there anything in the world that doesn't speak to you anymore? Every
Um,
way you turn, there's someone speaking.
I'd really have to think hard about that. No, I think everything is speaking.
It's interesting too how lots of voices, digital voices, are female.
Yeah, like
And
Siri
it's on the tube,
on
on
the
the on the tube. It's
So my husband's iPhone, his Siri is a man's voice.
yeah, well, you can change it. That's why.
Yeah, I don't know if he changed it or not. I just know it's always been a man's voice. But Alexa, Siri, like you said, the tube,
Yeah.
so many announcements are women's voices. That is interesting. That's worth a podcast digging into that.
Standing on platform 3 of the 1541. I mean, it is. I mean, I think there's something softer and more and warmer, but it's
Safer.
also
I would say safer.
safer. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's also, I don't know, something about it. It's worth thinking about.
It is worth thinking about. Speaking of things that are worth thinking about, our podcast today, we are going to talk, and we always say this briefly, about a new book, a biography on Jacques Derrida by Peter Salmon. And if you are watching this on YouTube, you can see the very cool, colorful book held up in the screen right now, but it's called An Event, comma, and then in italics, perhaps. So An Event, Perhaps, a biography of Jacques Derrida by
The
Peter.
book that you're reading.
Say that again?
This is a book that you're reading.
Yeah, it is a book that I'm reading. And I did my Patreon a little bit on the beginning of it yesterday and just kind of unpacking this concept and word of event. And I thought it would be really good if we had a wider conversation about it on our podcast, because I feel like, well, I feel a few things. One, we throw around French philosophy, structuralism, post-structuralism, certainly names like Lacan and Derrida all the time, and we don't really unpack them for people. And I think a lot of people throw names like Derrida around and maybe possibly don't really kind of understand maybe the depth and breadth of his work in his concepts like deconstruction, event, Lavaneer, all of these things that he spent his life developing, unpacking, generating, all of those things. And then also because the current conversation on deconstruction, we're not going to go into this a lot. We've talked a lot about it in the past few months, but of course has, co-opted and sort of commandeered this term deconstruction, which really has nothing to do with philosophical deconstruction. And also because we talk a lot about radical theology, in which we talk about the concept or the framework of God being understood within a paradigm of event and experience, as opposed to object and being, object and being referring to a metaphysical reality of an ontological being, an event and experience being something that sort of happens in a flash and then happens again and again, and it's unexpected and different every time, and has everything to do with our experience of it and nothing to do with actually agency outside of ourselves. And that's a radical theology thing. And that's a John Caputo thing. But what we don't always talk about is the deep ties to Derrida's work in the language of event. And as I started to read this biography, in just a few pages, you and I were in London this past week, and I was like, oh my God, I understand everything about existentialism, structuralism, post-structuralism, and like where event came from. And, in like literally like the first 3 or 4 pages, which is amazing because I've wanted to.
It's the mark of a really great book.
Yeah. And, I've wanted to read up more on the life of Derrida, and I always see that massive biography on your bookshelf, and I'm always very attracted to it, but I'm also very intimidated by it, which is why I haven't asked to borrow it. Like I have borrowed so many of your books already.
I always think, if you can, that one should try and find biographies or even autobiographies of people that you like, because it gives a context because, you know, concepts don't come out of thin air. And
Yeah.
there's a whole world of reasons as to how and why Derrida got to deconstruction. You know, it wasn't he
Yeah.
woke up one day and went, oh, I'm going to call it deconstruction. I mean, and it's because of, you know, events in his life and his thinking. And I've always loved, I view it like, it's like the backstory, but it
Mhm.
gives the front story meaning, like you understand, like, you know, Darwin's loss of faith in God because his beloved daughter dies, and it gives him an impulse to pursue something with a greater degree of fervor, because he's trying to come to terms with grief and loss, as well as be faithful to the new science that he's interested in, or, you know, how Frida Kahlo became the painter that she became because of situations and circumstances in her life. I love biographies. I think they're the missed opportunity in people's kind of theoretical and conceptual constructions.
Yeah. I agree. And this is certainly a fascinating one. And I'm not done with it yet, but I'm really excited to return to it again and again. And was just so moved because I just feel like someone like Jacques Derrida, unless you're into reading philosophy or into reading theology, and theology, you know, coming across Derrida is questionable depending on like what vein of theology you're reading, you're really not engaging this kind of thought at all. And you don't have to be engaging some kind of ivory tower understanding of philosophy for it to really change your life and to be transformative. And so one of the things I'm passionate about, you know, in the work we do together and the work I do on my Patreon and just the kind of work I do, we do in general, is being able to synthesize and move along this kind of information, these kinds of concepts. You know, we know that people don't have all the time in the world to sit and just read book after book, or have time and money to go to university or seminary or seminars or whatever it might be. And so what can we give people very quickly that they can kind of digest, ingest, and that can make meaning for them in that moment and change them on some level, you know,
Yeah,
in a more towards a more integrated understanding of like what it means to be human and alive and to engage all of these things. And so that's why I'm passionate about talking about some of this stuff and this concept that is wrapped up in event,
yeah,
as Derrida first uttered it at that philosophy conference in fall of 1966, where he just kind of, you know, broke structuralism straight down the middle and sort of left it for dead in wake of, you know, this introduction of event. I think expounding upon it just a little bit for Christians, for people of faith who are trying to engage in all that is new, so much of what they weren't expecting in terms of the turns that their faith has taken,
yeah,
the uncharted territories that they have sort of been led down in their pursuit of God and their pursuit of meaning and their pursuit of, you know, religion and all of these things. And I think one slap with event,
yeah,
um, you know, gives us the courage to keep going.
yeah. And when you, I mean, what's remarkable is, you know, as you just said, 1966, that's a long time ago in an entirely different world. I mean, that's not long after that whole brouhaha in American theological circles
Yeah,
around, you know, both the death of God and things like,
this
you know,
same year.
God by John Robinson and things like that. And
Mhm.
it's funny how these days in a lot of radical theology conversations, people have kind of left Derrida behind on some. I mean, they haven't left him behind. He just doesn't have the currency that he did probably in the 90s, you know.
Okay.
And it's funny how things come in waves, because I have a feeling there's going to be, and I don't know why I say this, but I think there's going to be a little bit of a recovery of a rediscovery of some of Derrida. Um, don't even know why I say that, but I think there's always that initial wave of interest, and then there's a kind of rejection, then there's a reappraisal, and then there's a kind of renewal of interest, and I think we might be up for a renewal, because I think the conversation, and maybe even in that wider deconstruction conversation, that will eventually find its way into that, and it won't just be.
I think people are
that conversation. Yeah, that conversation reminds me of, when I first started exploring postmodernism and stuff, and then in the 90s you started to see, people talking about postmodern sandwiches and all that kind of stuff. It became the hip word that was completely detached from its source, and it just became a kind of sign of something, but whatever it was a sign of was just a hint of what was really there. Anyway, what's the big takeaway from the book so far for you? The event deal?
Yeah, I think the big takeaway for me was, this is no different than any other thing we innovate upon and iterate upon, and we step out of into something new if we're brave enough to do so. So, you have the tradition of French existentialism in terms of, the location of meaning was strictly within the individual, within particulars of that individual's contextual locatedness, and all the rest of it. This was specific, really specifically understood within, literature and writing communities in terms of authorial intention and meaning lying solely with original authorial intention. And then French structuralism comes along and says, actually, it's not so much wrapped up in the individual and the existential kind of angst of the individual and meaning in that sense, but really everything can only be understood in relationship to each other. Everything is structured. And, I was trying to explain this to my husband. We went out for a gin, and he said, talk to me about this, explain this to me. So, I basically just picked up whoever was next to me, which was my mask. And I said, you can't understand this mask by pulling out a fiber. That's authorial. That's existentialism, trying to examine and interrogate the fiber to understand the mask. You can only understand the mask in terms of the relationship of the particles and the matter that connects it all and makes it be a mask. And this obviously gave existentialism a run for its money. And then you have Derrida come along, who at 36 in 1966 was really some unknown French philosophy professor, was invited at the last minute because someone else declined, also at the last minute. Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, the philosophy conference on structuralism, all the people, all the things and all the people, Gadamer, Lacan, all the usual suspects. And Derrida gets up, the last session, the last day, the last speaker, and he says, in fact, let me quote him in his opening line, and he went on for less than 30 minutes and changed everything. And he started with, perhaps something has occurred in the history of the concept of structure that could be called an event.
Yeah.
And it's essentially preparing for the engagement of the impossible and all that we didn't think was possible, all that we couldn't imagine was possible. Because if you can imagine it, then it's possible. If you can imagine it in any way, it already has a parameter around it and you have some sense of expectation. And this ties into his work, Lavaneer, which is, French for to come, and not to come in terms of how an English speaker would understand it in terms of located in the future, but coming at us from the future, from the past, from the present. It's this reoccurring thing that happens again and again. And every time it happens, it knocks us off our feet, picks us up in a spin if we're lucky, and keeps coming at us and changes again and again. And he's saying this idea of event is all that we cannot expect. And within structuralism, as an amazing feat as it was, it still became domesticated, like all things. It still became tamed, like most things that we step into that new and groundbreaking.
Every concept gets tamed.
Every concept gets domesticated. And so he comes onto the scene with this idea of event that changed everything. And so this is kind of the start of the book, but it really made me think about our podcast with John Caputo a few months ago, where he talked about, that Derrida would definitely be stepping away from language like event and deconstruction. And I love that, because I think, even though I haven't gotten near to the end of the book, I think the author picks up on that by saying an event, perhaps. Perhaps there will be an event, But maybe if Derrida was alive, maybe he would say, maybe event is now structuralism, and the perhaps is to event what event was just, I don't know, maybe he would come up with new language, because now event is already starting to be tamed and have some sense of expectation. I don't know. It opens up a part of life, a dimension of life for what we cannot explain, for experiences that we may have, for stories that might come at us or that we may come at. And there is no said structure to it. Maybe there's not even any meaning to it. And it's just a dimension of, unknowability, impossibility, unnamed, untamed, uncontained. And this is, obviously a lot of John Caputo's language as he takes off on concepts.
Yeah, it really kind of helps, I think, shine a light on how to understand Jack's work as well, because he always talks about, theology of the event. And even though he's actually moving away from that as well. So it's interesting that he also takes inspiration from Derrida and continues to explore whatever's going on.
Yeah.
Because he's uses perhaps, he uses event.
He does use perhaps. He does use it a lot. And I just think that there's a lot of comfort in this, because we don't have to understand event or perhaps or Lavaneer. All we have to know is that being human means that we get to be caught up in things that we cannot explain, that cannot be known, nor should we want to know them. But we are indeed open to being changed by them, to being spooked by them, as both Derrida and Caputo would say. And I just think there's a lot of freedom in that. I think it takes a lot of the pressure off. And I think that, speaking of domestication, we've really tried to domesticate our humanity and our meaning-making mechanisms. And it gets us into trouble again and again. It always has. Side by side, I'm actually reading another book, Culture and the Death of God, by Timothy. What's this? You've read it. What's it? Say that again.
Terry Eagleton.
Why did I think his name was Timothy? Because of the T. Terry Eagleton, in which he talks about, what religion has done to society. And as much as we seek transcendental experiences in other forms like art and music and literature and other things, that religion still gives all of it a run for its money. The name God, the container God, still represents a level of divinity that has not been able to be replicated to rival it. And so as important, as kind of this wild chase of divinity or the sacred, and I hate those terms, but even just meaning and storytelling in our own lives, and what it means to make sense of this crazy ride we're all on. Event makes room for all of that and more. And I love that. And I just think it takes because, even in the conversation that's happening now, the backlash against, traditional and conservative Christianity, it's still coming from, another plane of religiosity. An event has the potential to lift us from that plane for good. And so much more in a so much more exciting way. So I loved it, and I'm really excited to continue on.
Have you ever seen that documentary about Derrida?
No.
There's a documentary. I don't know. I mean, it came out a while ago, early 2000s, I think. It was called Derrida, but it's kind of fascinating because they have interviews with him, show some of his lectures, but they also have a lot of personal footage of him at home with his friends and family. It's a really nice little documentary. You should see if you can find it somewhere.
You see if you can find it somewhere and send me the link.
Okay, then I will do that.
Something else. How handsome was Jacques Derrida?
He was pretty handsome.
He was pretty handsome. And how much do we love saying the name Jacques?
Jacques Derrida.
anyway.
I was driving today with my brother, and he just got a bunch. It's funny. He got a bunch of CDs back from somebody that he lent them about 5 years ago, and he got 200 CDs back. So he had them in his car.
He lent out 200 CDs.
Well, my brother has a lot of music,
Yeah.
and anyway, he put in this CD, and who was on there? It wasn't Jacques. It was Johnny Hallyday.
Oh, Johnny Hallyday. Yeah.
But,
I was introduced to him living in France.
Jacques Brel.
Speaking of Johnny Hallyday, do you know how many people are not familiar with Serge Gainsbourg and Jane Birkin?
Well, are those people?
What?
Yeah. Well.
To explain to my husband who these people were. And then, I had that picture of them on the beach in Cannes in 1969 framed, and now it hangs in our lounge, and it's absolutely gorgeous. This is 70 by 100. And my husband put that on his Instagram and said, I want to know who knows who these people are, and did a sticker and a story, and nobody got it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would,
some people, my mother.
some people would say, oh, well, that's because they were from a long time ago, but they're from before you, and you know who they are.
The 60s and 70s. I mean, but they had some pretty iconic songs.
Hello. Yeah.
Hello. I mean, they're French icons.
And hello, Jane Birkin, who's English.
Well, and Birkin bag by Hermes. Hello.
Birkin bag. Hello.
Although she was trying a few years ago to get her name off of that bag because she became an animal rights activist and didn't want her name on their alligator bag. But anyway, I don't know how we got on that subject. Anyway, great to see everyone this week. That's great to talk with you a little bit about Derrida, and I'm sure we could have a whole podcast series just on him and his life, and I'm sure we'll be talking about him more.
Yeah. And everybody should do a search of Serge Gainsbourg. His reggae album is really good.
I didn't know he had a reggae album.
Oh, okay. I'm not even going to go there. Just add that to your list, but look for it. It's really good. He recorded it in Jamaica.
Sounds good. Will do.
So it's French speaking with reggae underneath it.
Love it. I'm here for it.
C'est magnifique.
Here for it, Baz. Here for it.
All right. Toodaloo.
Toodaloo. Bye, everyone. We'll see you next week.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Au revoir.
Au revoir. À bientôt.